we will get this video uploaded, so take notes as you wish. But I am going to go through this fairly quickly. All right? Ready? Let's do this. As always, I like to give credit for the historian who helped me out in providing some extra research, and this one is John Sachet. Not quite sure. He's from Florida. How is this Sasher? All right. So during the Civil War, Louisiana seceded from the United States. It sent thousands of Confederate soldiers out of the state. It witnessed Union invasion and occupation, saw the emancipation of more than 300,000 slaves. But ultimately, everyone's experiences in the war varied depending on where they lived, like what parish they lived in, if they lived in the city rather than the country, their race, as well as their level of wealth. But ultimately, everybody in the state was affected. After Lincoln's election in November 1860, Louisiana prepared first for secession and then for war. In December, Governor Thomas Overton Moore called for the election of delegates to a secession convention. Even before the meeting of that body, Moore ordered the seizure of the federal arsenal and barracks at Baton Rouge, along with Forts Jackson and St. Philip, which situated approximately 70 miles down the Mississippi River from New Orleans, guarded access to New Orleans from the Gulf of Mexico. In January 1861, there was an overwhelming vote taken, 113 to 17, in which the delegates voted for secession. 2 months later, the state joined the Confederacy. So this was a fairly rapid movement from being a part of the Union to being a part of the Confederacy. White male Louisianians very quickly volunteered for service. Somewhere around about 25,000 men volunteered to fight in the Confederacy. And eventually, through a combination of both volunteering and conscription. What's conscription?
Whenever you forcibly push people into service.
Very good. The draft, right?
Yes.
Okay, so with volunteering and conscription, or the draft, somewhere between 50 and 60,000 Louisianians would eventually serve in the Confederate Army. Most of these men served outside the state borders, especially in the Eastern Theater. During their sort of tenure with the Confederacy, a lot of the Louisiana troops ultimately earned the moniker Louisiana Tigers because they fought ferociously. That's the adjective that is most used to describe the Louisiana Confederate troops. They were ferocious. And they were also notoriously lacking in discipline. So you guys remember way back to the start of the semester in the essay we wrote about the moral climate of Louisiana?
Yeah.
What kinds of things do you think bothered those who served withLouisiana troops? What were Louisiana troops doing more than likely?
Drinking.
Drinking, lots of drinking. What else?
Probably lots of vulgar language, I would assume.
Yeah, tons of vulgarity, yeah, and and more than likely a lot of other troops may not have cared too much about that, but you never know. What were you gonna say, Christian?
Also thinking, like, compared to like the generals that were leading, most of them are West Point graduates, and so it's like they have this order being down to a T,
Yes.
and then they're dealing with this
Bunch of
rabble.
rednecks.
And they probably have a lot of people that don't go to church on Sunday, maybe.
Okay, so yeah, so there is this lack of morality is going to come out in speech and action. You've got order and hierarchy among the officer corps, and then here come these the Louisiana Tigers, once again, as they're referred to. And the image that I have for you is a painting that shows what a lot of the original Louisiana troops looked like. They wore these outlandish costumes, and eventually they did wear the sort of standard Confederate gray. But for the most part, they just walked in and you knew who they were as soon as you saw them. But just to give you an example of their fighting style, of their tenacity, and their unwillingness to back down. I believe it was at the Battle of Bull Run, or the second Battle of Bull Run. I might be getting that one incorrect. But And one of the major battles, you have Louisiana troops, and there were some others as well, but Louisiana troops were out of ammunition.
Oh, no.
And so they are frantically, as Union troops are coming towards them, they're frantically trying to get whatever they can off dead bodies. They're firing literally like musket to body. As soon as they get it, they're firing. But at one point they cross a hill and they've got nothing, and so their lieutenant commands them to pick up whatever rocks they can find.
That's
And they just start chunking rocks. And so there's this letter from the general that says, I've got to praise my Louisiana troops because they were killing people with rocks. They were picking up large rocks and chunking them and knocking these people out, sometimes fatally. So that's the tenacity that Louisiana troops were bringing to the Confederacy, and they earned that nickname and that reputation for
really stupid things.
for ferociousness. To protect Louisiana from naval invasion from the Gulf of Mexico, the Confederacy relied on Fort Jackson and St. Philip, as we mentioned earlier. They were augmented by obstructions placed in the river between the two forts. In April of 1862, so fairly early on in the war, the Union Army and Navy challenged these defenses. 14 of Admiral Farragut's ships ran past the forts and arrived unopposed outside the city of New Orleans on April 25th. In an effort to save the city from destruction, the Confederate General Lovell, who had approximately around about 3,000 inexperienced soldiers under his command, evacuated the city without a fight. They saw what was coming, figured probably best just to leave. The Union Navy quickly moved into the city. 3 days later, on April 28th, when the Confederate troops stationed at Fort Jackson mutinied and subsequently surrendered their fort, the Union capture of the Confederacy's largest city and most important seaport was secured. So we've talked about New Orleans before. I mean, what's the big deal about New Orleans?
If you control New Orleans, you control the Mississippi.
Very good. The Mississippi River really is the key. Now, New Orleans is a pretty important port for imports, right? But New Orleans really signifies control of the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi is so much more than just Louisiana. This goes all the way up to the top, right? So the Mississippi is incredibly important. But New Orleans is the largest city in the Confederacy at this point. It's probably one of the most financially stable, to an extent. And the seaport itself is its importance cannot be understated. So the Union's takeover of New Orleans inaugurated the reign of martial law under this guy right here, General Benjamin the Beast Butler. Butler and his men ruled the city for only about 8 months, but they had a reputation for robbing residents, and he earned a second nickname of Spoons because they liked to take things like silverware. He authorized the execution of William Mumford, who was a local gambler, who ultimately tore down an American flag outside the U.S. Mint. And this execution only encouraged people to dislike him all the more. Even to this day, people refer to Butler as the Beast Butler down in New Orleans.
I would call them Spoons just for fun.
Yeah. Most infamously, on May 15th, 1862, he issued General Order 28, also known as the Woman Order. Now, does anybody know anything about the Woman Order?
Wasn't that where he basically was saying like a woman insulting a soldier would be a big crime?
Yeah, basically, women who insulted Union troops could be held liable as prostitutes. Okay, now let's think back to the essay, The Murder of a Lewd and Abandoned Woman, right? How does the city view prostitutes?
They're not really worth anything.
Ew.
Ew, there we go. That one's
But
ew.
it's going on a lot.
What?
But it's still going on a lot.
Okay, why is it still going on?
Well, the moral climate.
Oldest profession.
The moral climate, it's the oldest profession. Why is it that in The Murder of a Lewd and Abandoned Woman, in that essay, why, at first, was the murderer found guilty?
Because it's a jury of working class people.
Okay, and the working class felt some sort of connection to prostitutes, right? At least to their lot in life. But what about the upper class? Why were there no upper class men on the jury?
Because they
No,
took their way out of it.
They got their way out of it. They knew all the loopholes, so they were able to get out of it. So how does the upper and middle class, how do those classes look or view prostitutes?
Not very highly.
Yeah, that's putting it nicely, I guess.
What are the words used to describe the prostitute? What are some phrases?
Lewd.
I don't know.
Lewd, okay, we mentioned that one. What are some other phrases?
There's one like I can see it, but I can't say it. And maybe it doesn't matter. I'll just go. Yes.
What kind of, there you go, get up for yes. What kind of woman was she?
Oh, it was bold. Bold was a word.
Okay, bold. These women are bold because why? They're going out and they're advertising their wares. And what's their wares? Their body, right? Okay, so they're bold. What else?
They're considered like, I don't know if I'd say ugly, but like a lot of them were considered not attractive
Why?
because they were prostitutes.
Because they're prostitutes. What did they say about the woman who was murdered? Well, the journalist says, well, she would be attractive.
If it had not been for the bold aspect and visible depravity which characterized her class, she would have been considered handsome.
There we go. All right, so more often than not, we have prostitutes, especially by the upper middle classes, refer to prostitutes as fallen women, right?
Right.
They're not the same as upper and middle class women. So here we go. We've got any woman who insults Union troops could be held liable as prostitutes.
I would get in so much trouble. I understand.
Okay, let's just think about this. Who are probably going to be more likely than any other woman to insult a Union troop?
Us.
Okay, middle class white women, middle class and upper class white, because most of them own slaves, right? Enslaved property. And more than likely, these women, and we have to remember that in New Orleans, there is a large section of people who were pro-union.
Mm-hmm.
But there's definitely that culture in the South, and we see this in Louisiana as well. These women are following along with their husband's political ties as well.
Yes, we are.
Right? So they're very pro-Confederate and very anti-union. We also know, because we talked about the cult of true womanhood, remember that? And what is woman supposed to be? Pious,
And
pure, submissive, and domestic, right? Those are all the four things of the cult of true womanhood. And all of those things lead her to become involved in various organizations, right? Like church groups, and all of these organizations ultimately push women further and further into the political sphere. So women are finding an outlet for themselves to have some sort of voice, ultimately through like insulting Union troops when they come into town, right?
It's probably
Different
why you
things
put
like
that up there.
Yeah, there's different things. So, so women can now be held liable as prostitutes. In response to Butler's conduct, Confederate President Jefferson Davis called for his execution. Yeah. And Governor Moore urged that the Confederacy execute a Union prisoner of war in retaliation for Mumford's death, the gambler who tore down the American flag. The governor also issued a public statement lambasting Butler's savagery and calling for Louisianians to enlist in the army in order to avenge their state's honor. Now, again, Butler's only there for about 8 months, and let's point this out. A lot of the Union troops are not too happy with Butler either. I say Union troops, the Union leaders and Abraham Lincoln, they're not too happy with how Butler is handling things either. Now, there are some defenders who bring out a couple of different things. He was praised for quickly pacifying the city without much violence and for ordering the cleaning of the city. Was New Orleans dirty?
Yes.
Yeah, in more ways than one, but New Orleans is a dirty city.
I think the book said like he actually managed to get cleaner than ever been, and then once he was gone, it fell back into the squalor for
Yes.
many years afterwards.
Yes, so Butler comes in and he orders the cleaning of the city, which ultimately reduces that annual influx of disease, typhoid, malaria, yellow fever, all of those diseases that we can see like open pots of water and different things like that. And if you can imagine sewage on the street, animal waste on the street, all of that is this breeding ground for bacteria and for mosquitoes carrying different sicknesses and all of that. So, so he cleans the city. He also, some people applaud him for feeding the city's hungry residents as well as providing some work for the poor. While much of the population decried his presence, the city's unionists welcomed Northern troops. Once again, in really anywhere in the South, you're going to find small pockets of people who are pro-union. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to traditionalist ideas in 19th century terms of liberalism and conservatism. There are a number of conservatives in the South who want to preserve the Union more than anything else, right? The traditional way of life sort of rules. More than 5,000 white Louisianians fought in the Union Army, many of them coming from New Orleans. In particular, many of the city's immigrants comprised about 38% of the white population, and they had no loyalty whatsoever to the Confederacy, and were very quick to swear Union loyalty oaths. And thinking about the war from 1862 to 1863, this is whenever we're finally going to see, I say finally, this is when we're going to see Louisiana starting to respond. Not quite en masse, but close enough to it. In 1862, the Union's incursions did not stop at the Crescent City. After securing New Orleans, the Navy proceeded up the Mississippi River and without opposition took control of the state capital at Baton Rouge on May 9th. Because of the Union invasion, Confederates moved the capital first to Opelousas and then subsequently to Shreveport. In August of that year, the Confederates attempted to regain Baton Rouge. In this battle, the Union's Navy coming from the South Mississippi River proved decisive. So the Confederates sort of retreat, but they group together once again, hoping to challenge the river supremacy by sending in their boat, the Arkansas, downriver. But it lost engine power just north of the city.
Well,
so what are you going to do? Ironically, the Union Army actually pulls out of Baton Rouge just a few weeks later, but at the end of the year, they do come back. They had to consolidate their forces in New Orleans. They do come back to retake Baton Rouge, retake control. In October of 1862, Union forces also moved west from New Orleans. Victory at the Battle of Lavadeville?
I don't know.
No, get fancy over there.
Let's say Lavadeville, okay? All right,
Lavadeville.
Battle of Lavadeville.
Let's do it.
On October 27th, assured them access to New Orleans, Opelousas, the Great Western Railroad, and probably most significantly to the sugarcane plantations in Lafourche. After repeated requests from Governor Moore, the Confederate government finally sent a general to Louisiana. In late 1862, Richard Taylor, who was a Louisiana plantation owner and son of President Zachary Taylor, you guys remember him, took command of the District of Louisiana, the area of the state west and south of the Mississippi. In his memoirs, Taylor depicts his new command as having no soldiers, no arms or munitions, and no money within the limits of the district, so he's got nothing. Through recruiting and conscription, Taylor gathered a small force of 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers, and these men spent much of the 1863 time period sparring with federal troops in the Bayou Teche campaigns. With an occupying Union Army, but few Confederate troops stationed within its borders, some Louisianians turned to guerrilla warfare. What does that mean? What's guerrilla warfare?
Striking hard and fast in small groups.
Okay,
Not
very
having
good.
a lot of bases.
Not having a lot of
Hiding out in
bases.
the, hiding out in the wilderness.
It's like always being on the move, kind of.
Very good. You're setting up lots of ambushes, that kind of thing.
Sneaky fighting.
Sneaky fighting, there we go. Yes, sneaky fighting, okay. In summer of 1862, Louisiana stood virtually undefended, and consequently, Governor Moore called for the organization of local partisan ranger organizations to combat Union troops. So in other words, if you guys aren't gonna be in the Confederate Army, you can at least form some posses.
Not to
Right.
do something.
You can do something. While these units had official status, many residents fought without sanction. That's gonna lead to problems. Spoiler alert. Although guerrillas helped confine Union troops to the area around New Orleans and Baton Rouge, their actions often enraged their fellow residents because their neighbors were suffering from reprisals of Union troops. So this obviously presents a problem. General Butler offered a $1,000 bounty for each guerrilla captured.
Wow.
But more commonly, Union troops simply retaliated against the citizens living in areas of guerrilla activity. So they're going to burn crops, they're gonna take stuff, they'll loot, they'll vandalize, so on and so forth. But just to give a specific example, in August 1862, Admiral Farragut ordered the shelling and burning of Donaldsonville in response to repeated sniper attacks against naval vessels in the Mississippi River. So we're demolishing entire cities in response to these guerrilla
Just
tactics.
because you can't take out the person hiding in the bushes, you're gonna burn down an entire town?
Alexander the Great found
He did.
found things like that to be effective, right?
He sure did.
Particularly after the Confederacy started strictly enforcing conscription laws, right, that's the draft, the guerrillas operated with less and less official sanction and less allegiance to the Confederacy. Often labeled as Jayhawkers, you saw that phrase in your first essay, which we're about to talk about. Some groups combined draft dodgers, deserters, and outlaws, and they fought against both Union and Confederate soldiers while preying on the civilian population.
So they just didn't pick a side then.
Their loyalty, they became more like mercenaries. Their loyalty
Mercenaries
was
of
to
time.
themselves.
Interesting.
With Louisiana's swamps, bayous, and piney woods offering ideal terrain for irregulars, these Jayhawker bands could number as high as 1,000 men. Probably the most famous of these was Azen Carrier, which led probably the most notorious of these groups. Based west of Opelousas, his gang gathered different conscripts from St. Landry and neighboring parishes, an area whose reputation for lawlessness predated the Civil War. His men fought against Confederate conscription officers, they robbed civilians, and they refused an offer to join the Union Army. Now, let's go to your first essay, because it ties in so beautifully with this point right here, right? Okay, so the first essay by Michael Wade, I would rather be among the Comanches, the military occupation of Southwest Louisiana. And I do apologize, I neglected to get a map to show, so that we could have an image of what Southwest Louisiana looks like. But let's define that. What is Southwest Louisiana?
I'm gonna guess probably west of Lafayette,
Very good. West of Lafayette.
south of Stenlaw.
Very good. So, you guys know how awesome an artist I am.
You are.
All right, so there's Louisiana.
Sort of.
Sort of. It's got more of like a weird.
It's more of a square toe boot than it is a.
That is true. It is more like a square toe boot. There we go. Does that work? All right.
That's yeah.
It works. Okay. So basically, if we've got New Orleans down here, right? We've got somewhere in there. There's New Orleans. Lafayette, which at this point in time was called what? Vermilionville. Vermilionville. So, and then we've got our Mississippi River kind of running like that, right? Somewhere along that with the Red River breaking off.
In the middle.
Right? Okay. So the west is going to be, or the southwest is really going to be like this.
Yeah, because I live in the north, and so I'm more in the middle between Lafayette and NOLA.
Oh, you're like right there?
Yeah, in that area.
Okay. And this is where we are, right?
Mhm.
Sinla, okay. So, we'll just leave that up there for a moment because we obviously need to have sort of a point of reference. Right, maybe?
I
And I don't
know.
have a.
I quit.
Okay, so, question number one, in talking about, the military occupation of Southwest Louisiana, this is post-Civil War, right? But this is also during. We have to remember that Reconstruction really started in 1862 in Louisiana. So this is an occupied territory for quite some time. What were the physical costs of the war to Southwest Louisiana?
Well, obviously crops got burned, houses got demolished,
Roads are
People's-
messed up.
yeah, roads were destroyed.
Roads were really messed up to the point to where, what did they say about them?
Actually, there was a really funny thing in here. Let me just find it. They also took a lot of livestock and like just ripped up everything is what they basically did.
So the cattle and other creatures couldn't be kept away from the growing crops because there was nothing to like separate them.
Okay, what happened to those separations? What happened to those fences?
They use it, they're like used as firewood and different things.
Very good. Union troops are taking these, whatever items they can come across, and they're making beds and fires.
Yep.
Right? They're making beds and fires, which means that there's no more fences for livestock, which means livestock is just going to wander, meaning they're going to trample and eat and ultimately
Destroyed.
really mess up or destroy crops. But you also have human forces at work as well, right? Because you have humans that are also taking things, like they're taking the food, they're not necessarily destroying it, but they will come in and take it. They will destroy things like sugarcane crops, because that's going to severely cut out, like cut the legs off the economy. So the sugarcane crop is going to be destroyed. Cotton is, they'll take whatever they can and they'll ship it up north, right, to take away. Whatever they can't do easily, they will destroy, because again, that's taking away from that financial support that Louisianians are sort of counting on. At one point, the author mentions somebody who says that no plantation had 2 chickens left on it. So there's very little left, to the point to where now people are literally starving, right? Starvation is becoming a problem. So the physical costs are rather high, aren't they?
Yeah.
All right, number 2, what problems did the new system of labor that replaced slavery present for both blacks and whites? First of all, what is the new system of labor?
Was it basically just being drafted into the army? And like
What?
trying to like rebuild what was going on?
Not quite.
I mean,
What kind of labor do they have in the South?
Farming.
Okay, there's farming labor, and is it free labor or slave labor?
Generally, there's a lot of slave labor.
Okay, so when Union troops come in,
I know like for the women it was like house cleaning and
Mhm.
stuff.
okay, a lot of domestic duties and whatnot.
Yeah.
So what is this new system, this new labor system that replaces slavery?
Look at them, darn it.
They're gonna have to, they can't have slaves anymore, so they're gonna have to hire pretty much everyone, but some of them are essentially gonna be trapped to the land.
Okay, how are they trapped to the land? What do they have to sign?
Contracts,
Contracts that last for how long?
a year or so.
Very good. They have to sign year-long contracts. And these contracts, they're really both good and bad. Because one, you have people who have the opportunity to work, and they know they're not gonna be out the job anytime soon, right? I mean, they know that contract's going to last for a full year. But you have people who have been technically freed from slavery, who are continually tied to the same land, more often than not, tied to the same land, working for, more often than not, the same people, right?
And now it's by contract instead of,
Right, now, and this is going to have huge implications for how labor is going to, take shape in the South post-Civil War. Because we are going to get to the point to where we have these contracts which are signed between landowner and farmer, and it's going to create a system, the sharecropping system, right? Sharecropping, and also the crop lien system, which really is, it is probably the one thing that makes the South as destitute as it is for so many years following Reconstruction. Okay, so that's the new system, right? They're signing annual labor contracts, they're working for a set amount, right? What problems does this new system present for both blacks and whites? We just talked about some of them, like this, it does have future implications. It's going to establish that, that sharecropping system and the crop lien system, which are going to really, really hurt. They're going to cause a whole bunch of credit problems and money problems in the future. But what's going on? What are some of the immediate problems that blacks and whites are going to face because of that new labor system?
I think I'm not sure if I'm exactly right, so it's been a while since I read this one. So, they're having to sign these contracts, and they can't get out of them legally. So if the person you're working for is cheating you, because I'm sure there's loopholes in this thing, people that they're working for, and they're not a kind boss to be under, you can't get out of that. So that's gonna cause like rebellion among your workers at this point, and kind of anarchy.
Okay,
in a
we've
sense.
got problems of violence.
Yeah.
Right? Immediate problems of violence.
Good. It was right there.
Yeah, who more often than not are the targets of violence?
The African Americans.
Right, okay, so the former slaves are more often than not the targets of violence, right? Now, the Union occupying force refuses employers to use corporal punishment, right? It says that corporal punishment is no longer allowed in this new labor system. They're trying to basically recreate this part of the South, and eventually the entire South, in the image of the North, right? The free labor,
Right.
free industrial North, right? Okay, so without the use of corporal punishment, what do whites lose?
While they're authority.
Yeah,
Okay.
they're upper hand.
Okay, so if they cannot use violence, physical punishment to keep people acting a certain way, this is going to start hit very, very deeply on that sense of racial superiority, isn't it?
Yep.
There, you see a lot of problems with white manhood, this idea of what makes me a man. And the South, during this time period, a part of what made white men men was the fact that they could dominate women and blacks.
That's still kind of like not necessarily like the racial aspect of it, but being able to take down another guy, that's sort of.
Yes,
The
ideas
definition
of
for a man.
masculinity are, you know, they sort of change and flux over time, just like the ideas of femininity do. But we have to think about these problems that are coming up immediately. This is only going to increase tension and ultimately increase the lawlessness, right, that he talks about.
Well, yeah, because it's gonna be like nobody can tell me that I can't punch another guy in the face if he insults me, you know.
Very good, exactly right. Okay. Let's look at number 4. What difficulties did the federal commander Norton face in trying to keep order?
I felt kind of bad for this guy because he seemed like he was doing a good thing, you know, like he was.
Or at least trying.
Yeah, he was
right?
trying to do a good thing. Like nobody wanted to be under like the African Americans didn't want anything to do with being underneath a white man's rule, and then he had a lot of African American troops under him as well, and so none of the white men were going to listen to the troops. So it was like just chaos.
Okay, very good. So we do have a lot of chaos because he has a lot of black troops under his command who are trying to enforce authority or enforce law and order,
Yeah,
right?
that's morbid.
Now, they are more apt to enforce law and order on whites than they are on blacks.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, now they have the power to.
Duh, right? I mean, this is, they now have the opportunity to exert authority without reprisals, at least
Not a lot of.
not a whole lot of reprisals, and not on them, right? It's gonna be more so on the people who are not serving. So there's just, once again, that racial tension is presenting a lot of difficulties for Norton in trying to keep order. What happened after the withdrawal of federal troops? What happens to the law and order that he's able to
It
produce,
disappears.
develop?
It kind of collapses.
It does, it just implodes, right? Everything
That
just
was my little
goes away. Now, why? Because Michael Wade makes an argument about why this happened. What is his argument?
I think his argument was that the government wasn't helping Norton at all. Like, he was having to beg for food, he was begging for reinforcements, he was begging for shelter at this point. And so obviously the man got tired and he left. And our author kind of made the argument, if the government would have helped, like provided support, and then Norton would have been able to establish a more stable form of government while he was
Okay.
there.
This really is sort of a twofold argument, right?
Mhm.
The first part is he doesn't have what he needs.
Nope.
He doesn't have the support necessary for a successful long-term establishment, right, of law and order. But there's something else that's bigger in the author's mind. And he makes a connection even to World War II. And he says that it's kind of a stretch, but that he sees somewhat of a parallel. Look on the very last page of the essay, page 140.
I know it said like if the military stayed involved, like there wouldn't be any problems.
Yeah.
Very good.
So he was basically pro
Yeah,
military.
you can compare it to Germany and Japan, where after those wars, American military was in there to help rebuild in the vacuum. So I think what he's saying here is that Louisiana, the Southwest Louisiana, did not have enough time to actually reestablish government and order.
Okay, he argues that an extended period of military occupation would have been better.
He said
It would have prevented
current
that.
violence and unreconstructed white efforts to restore black to some semblance of servitude. Because they the troops took out the black code and were protecting African Americans. And when they left, that kind of took all that away from them.
Right, what were you saying, Yara?
They wouldn't have had like everyone wouldn't have been on a power trip, basically. Like
Yeah.
they wouldn't have been trying to be in control if the military stayed.
And white people would have calmed down.
Okay, so had the military stayed for longer, had they remained in that area for a couple more years, that this author would argue that more than likely law and order could have been solidified and at least civil interaction taking place between different ethnicities and different classes. Now, we can't really argue from hypotheses, you're right? We can't really argue counterfactual history. We can't really do that, can we? What ifs, those are great to think about. What if? Well, it didn't happen,
No, it didn't.
right? So since it did not happen, it's a very, very difficult argument to make. But he does bring up those examples where we say, okay, we can see how in these other instances that an extended period of military occupation, it seemed to work. So
I agree with his logic.
yeah, the logic seems like it could be there. All right, let's move back to our lecture. And when we get done with that, we will go into our second essay. Everybody good? Feel great? What's the Anaconda Plan? Those of you who have taken or are currently taking American South with Dr. Picard or have taken US 1 and US 2 history, what's the Anaconda Plan?
Or disappointment. We're sorry.
Would that have been maybe some kind of plan to take out maybe take parts of the Mississippi River at a time?
Sort of. What's an anaconda?
A big, giant, ugly, terrifying snake.
There we go. Okay.
It,
A horrible creature.
I hate
in
snakes.
the, wait, no, I'm thinking of a boat perspective.
Okay. All right. It's a horrible snake. But the idea is, how does it kill its prey?
By
It's gonna
attacking
squeeze
it,
it,
yeah.
right? It's gonna surround it, wrap it, squeeze it till it dies, and eat it.
So the Anaconda plan would have been just like cut off Confederate troops, cut off areas, and wait for them to
Die.
die.
To suffocate,
To
right?
destroy themselves.
Right, okay, so the Anaconda plan is the Union strategy, right? And part of the Anaconda plan is that they need to take the Mississippi. If they take the Mississippi, they sever the South in half. Well, actually, more than half, right?
Yeah.
They cut off a huge portion of the South from other portions, but ultimately they effectively split it. Then let's have several blockades of the major ports, and with more pressure coming down from the north onto coming down from Washington D.C. into Richmond and other areas, that the Union Army will effectively be able to squeeze and eventually strangle the South. Right? Okay. Yeah. That was the theory, but that's the plan that the Union Army has taken.
Good plan.
The key component, or a key component of the strategy, is to capture the Mississippi River in order to divide the Confederacy into parts. Simultaneous with its 1862 invasion up the Mississippi River, the Union Army had also driven down the river as well. By the beginning of 1863, the Union controlled the entire Mississippi River except for the 150-mile portion between Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Port Hudson, Louisiana, which is somewhere around about 20 miles north of Baton Rouge. So, because my picture is wrong here, let's redraw our Mississippi River, right? So the Mississippi comes up kind of like this, right? Yeah, kind of goes like that. I have to cross the Mississippi when I get into Mississippi on Mondays and whatnot. So here comes our Red River. All right, so, and again, I do apologize for not having a map. That would be so much better. Okay, so there's this stretch of river, right? Somewhere between like
There and there.
here, because it's fairly close to Alexandria as well,
Yeah.
and here, somewhere around about, there's about 150 miles that the Union does not have control over. And they need control over the Mississippi River if this Anaconda plan is going to work. So, we see, I call it the Port Hudson campaign, but it's really not just about Port Hudson. Since we're focusing on Louisiana, that's why I called it that. On the northern end, right, on the end that's towards Vicksburg, the Union's advance against Vicksburg led to numerous incursions into the Louisiana parishes on the opposite bank. On the southern end, General Nathaniel Banks, who had replaced Butler in New Orleans, ordered ill-fated assaults on Port Hudson in both May and June of 1863. So they are attacking this place more than once. Despite being greatly outnumbered, the garrison did not surrender until July 9th. So for over 2 months, for nearly 3 months now, you have General Banks who's going after Port Hudson. He's simply unsuccessful. With its capitulation, the Union Army controlled the full length of the Mississippi River, thereby severing the Confederacy in two. So this was a very strategic part of the river that the Union Army was able to gain, and this is huge. But the Port Hudson campaign also marked one of the first uses of African American troops, and this is known as the Louisiana Native Guard. Ironically, the Louisiana Native Guard was initially a Confederate unit comprised of around about 800 free African Americans, free people of color, who basically were hoping to maintain their social status as a separate caste from the enslaved. The Confederacy obviously had no intention of using these men as part of its army.
Right.
After the Union captured New Orleans, some of these native guards offered their services to General Butler, And on September 27th, 1862, the 1st Louisiana Native Guard became the Union Army's first officially sanctioned African American unit. Did you have to say something, Christian?
No.
Oh, okay. The regiment continued to include freemen, such as P.B.S. Pinchback, who would later serve as the South's only African American governor during Reconstruction. Former slaves, however, now comprised a majority of the troops. As it did in other states, the Union Army primarily employed these men in like basic fatigue duties, you know, clean out the latrine, make food, carry stuff, that kind of thing. But in May 1863, they mounted a hopeless charge, but they mounted a charge at Fort Hudson. While they failed in their military goal, their actions contributed to a changing attitude toward the use of African American troops. And it's because of the Louisiana Native Guard that we see Lincoln and others beginning to start to favor using more black troops in the Union Army. Eventually, more than 24,000 African American Louisianians would fight for the U.S. during the Civil War. These troops ultimately symbolize the most dramatic of the changes Louisiana witnessed during the war, which is the ending of slavery. Right, this is huge. In 1860, Louisiana had over 300,000 slaves, which were basically 46.8% of the state's population. So nearly half of the state's population were enslaved. Emancipation came unevenly. As soon as General Butler arrived in New Orleans, runaway slaves who were known as contrabands escaped to his lines. Officially, Butler returned the slaves belonging to loyal slaveholders, so those who were pro-Union in the city or outside the city. If slaves escaped to Union lines, Butler officially returned them, but he allowed slaves of Confederate owners to remain in New Orleans. But in practice, this distinction was very difficult to maintain.
What was the point of that?
Well,
Well, you are gonna want to take and keep these Union supporters happy and on your side.
Well, the Union
So-
supporters were supporting the Union wanted to end slavery.
well, let's clarify something here. Did the Union want to end slavery?
He wanted to make it
Lincoln,
nicer.
in his inaugural address, said that he'd do whatever it took to keep the Union together, whether it meant ending slavery or not.
Very
That's
good.
true.
The
He
sole
wanted-
purpose of the Civil War is not to end slavery, it's to preserve the Union. Now, Abraham Lincoln does say in an 1858 speech, presidential debate with Stephen Douglas, he says, this house cannot permanently remain half slave and half free. He did not believe that the house would fall, but he did believe that it would cease to exist divided, basically, right? So, and later on, he says that he didn't know how, but he knew that somehow slavery started the war. But let's be clear, the Union's goal is not to emancipate slaves. The Union's goal is to preserve the Union. It is to keep the United States intact.
It's just so frustrating because it's like kind of a pawn game. It's like if these Confederate people, their slaves run over here, then sure, freedom for you guys, but sorry, you guys have to go back because we don't want to make our brothers really mad at us. It's like,
Well, but here's the thing, how do you know?
who's who? Yeah.
How do you know? And so Butler, who was pro-abolition, not quite an immediatist like others, but he is very much pro-abolition and pro-emancipation. Butler says, how do I know the difference? And actually, against Lincoln's orders, he continued to accept runaway slaves into his protection, into his little sphere of protection, even though Lincoln had said, don't do that. And so he treats them as contraband. What's that?
Forbidden materials.
Okay, like he says, you know what? It's like I've stolen you. in
It's
a
like
way,
heated
right?
blankets aren't allowed in cotton.
Yeah.
Or in
So,
Sorry.
So anyway, so yes, we need to be very clear on that the Union Army, the federal government, its goal is not to free the slaves. Its goal is to preserve the Union. It's not until 1863, 1864 that we really see the entire Union coming together under the banner of, we're going to free the slaves. And even then, it's to break the back of the Confederacy.
They should really talk about that more in high school.
Well, they should do a lot of things in high school.
They really should.
Okay. A similar divergence occurred when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, which freed the slaves in rebel-controlled areas, but not those within Union lines. It also did not free the enslaved of border states, right? So again, this is 1863. The Emancipation Proclamation is not a blanket, everybody who's enslaved is now free. No. There's a deadline of January 1, 1863, which says, hey, if you come back into the Union before this time, you get to keep your property. All of it.
Wow.
Right? It's all about preserving the Union. So, in Louisiana, this meant that slaves in New Orleans and many of the sugarcane parishes that came from the Fouche did not fall under its mandate. Nevertheless, the state Unionist 1864 Constitution ended this distinction by abolishing slavery in Louisiana a year before the 13th Amendment ended slavery in the United States. During this whole process, the Union Army helped supervise a transition from slave labor to free wage labor, which ultimately was a transition that was still incomplete at the war's end. The 1864 Constitution was emblematic of Louisiana's role as a test case for President Lincoln's Reconstruction policies. As early as December 1862, the Union government held congressional elections in New Orleans. Later, Lincoln's proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction called for a state's re-entry in the Union after a portion of the population equaling 10% of the votes cast in the 1860 presidential election swore loyalty to the U.S. This is Lincoln's famous 10% plan. Okay, so somebody translate what I just said. Stephen, tell me.
Basically, if 10% of the population is willing to declare loyalty to the Union, then the state can go back.
Okay. This plan went into effect in Louisiana in 1864, which resulted in a new constitution that did end slavery, but did not enfranchise African Americans. Okay, so they still are not allowed to vote. The end of slavery was only one of the many changes to the home front in Louisiana. The absence of military-age white males, the disruption of the sugar and cotton trade, rampant inflation, lack of credit, the presence of an occupation army, and some Confederates as well, all of this contributed to tremendous suffering in the civilian population. We talked about starvation because armies either seized or destroyed food crops. Some planters who had the money fled to Texas, oftentimes with their human property. Other Louisianians struggled to feed, clothe, and house themselves. The Confederate state government tried to help by allocating around about $5 million to soldiers' families, as well as distributing food to those in need, but this was nowhere near sufficient to alleviate any of the suffering in the state, especially in those areas that saw repeated Union incursions. All right, the Red River Campaign. The Red River Campaign really marks the end of the Civil War in Louisiana, at least, because by this time, by the end of the Red River Campaign, pretty much everybody in Louisiana is like, we're done. We're ready for this to end. The last major campaign in Louisiana is the Union Army's drive up the Red River in 1864. General Nathaniel Banks led the expedition, which aimed to capture Shreveport, open the way for an invasion of Texas, to destroy General Taylor's Confederate force, and to seize cotton from Red River plantations. Shreveport held significance because it's the home of both Louisiana's Confederate governments. By March, or of Louisiana's Confederate government, excuse me. By March, the combined Federal Army Navy operation succeeded in capturing Alexandria. So Alexandria is part of that Red River Campaign. In April 1864, however, General Banks moved beyond Alexandria, and his naval support challenged Taylor's Confederates. The battles of Mansfield and Pleasant Hill halted the Union advance, and they retreated, leaving much devastation in its wake. So the Union Army was stopped at these two particular places, and as they retreated, they ultimately destroyed pretty much everything in the path. In particular, Union and Confederate soldiers exchanged accusations over who would have responsibility for the fire that burned much of Alexandria as Union troops left the town. The Red River Campaign ultimately concluded operations in Louisiana. By 1865, most Louisianians just wanted the war to end. After General Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, a few diehards in Louisiana wanted to keep it going, and they tried to hold out longer. So, for example, General Edmund Kirby Smith, he and his army did not surrender until May 26, 1865, making it the last Confederate army to surrender. Most, however, just simply went home to rebuild. As a precursor to our last essay, let me read a couple of things about Reconstruction. Reconstruction comprises the post-Civil War period in U.S. history, together with the federal policies that were implemented during that time to bring secessionist states back into the Union and to determine the status of former Confederate leaders and former slaves in the South. The politics of Reconstruction profoundly affected life in Louisiana, but because so much was at stake, Louisiana also played a disproportionately large role in shaping national opinion and federal policy toward the defeated South after the war. Within the context of the region, Louisiana was an enormous prize. It was home to New Orleans, the South's largest and most prosperous city, and the crucial juncture between the commerce of the vast Mississippi River Valley and the rest of the world. The countryside of the state featured some of the richest and most productive soil in the nation. Louisiana also held out the promise of being equally fertile ground for the growth of republicanism in the South. Louisiana had been a bastion of the Whig Party before the war. The Whigs are those traditionalists, right? And they're going to be, we'll find several pro-union men within the Whig Party. They enjoyed a comparatively large and well-educated free black population. For these reasons, the Republicans, those are the guys who are pro-free labor and industry, all that jazz, they're up north. For these reasons, the Republicans fought with singular tenacity for control over the state. Defeated white Southerners, on the other hand, were just as unwilling to meekly forfeit dominion over a society where they had once ruled. Such conditions guaranteed that the struggle for control of Louisiana would be particularly intense. Indeed, it is no wonder that Reconstruction lasted longer in Louisiana than it did anywhere else, spanning the 15-year period from the spring of 1862 to the early months of 1877. So, with that lead in, let's go to your next essay. Feuding is our means of societal regulation. And when you say it with that kind of accent, it really sounds the way it should.
It really makes it worse.
Let's take off the G to feuding.
Feuding?
Feuding is our means of societal regulation.
That's what they sure did.
All right. And it's also, this essay goes very well with the other one because it's dealing with that lawlessness. Now, we're moving out of the West and we're going into the piney woods. And the piney woods are where?
In the Florida parishes.
Florida parishes, but we're also talking about where we are right now. Right? Pineville. So we're really looking at, like,
Right there.
Baton Rouge. We're looking at Cenla. That's really what we're looking at. We're looking at Cenla, with the exception of Baton Rouge and Florida parishes. Okay, but that's what we're looking at. We're looking at, like, the center of the state. How did the collapse of Reconstruction fuel instability in the Florida parishes?
It leaves a major power vacuum, and so suddenly you have all these basically white middle class men trying to fill it in, and they're not used to being able to play. They're not used to playing politics.
Okay,
But
very,
they know how to
and then-
fight and feud.
okay, what?
I was gonna say, politics was like choppy. It was factionalized. So
Faction, yes, that's a very good word, factionalized. Okay, now what are our two factions that are in this area?
The courthouse or something like that.
Yeah, the courthouse faction and the branchmen.
The branch man.
Okay, the courthouse faction and the branchmen. Now, who makes up the courthouse faction?
That's the respectable gentlemen, the family men, the working, you know, they have steady jobs and, you know.
Generally Richard.
Yeah.
Okay,
High
these
class
are
fellas.
very good, and respectable, like we talked about before, about what makes a respectable man. You're married,
You go to
you're
church.
working, you go to church, stuff like that, right? Okay, so,
older.
so these are the men who formerly held power, aren't they?
Yes.
These are the former elite, more often than not. So the courtroom faction has men who are in their upper 30s,
36 was the
on
general
average,
age.
right? Yeah, mid to upper 30s. They're married and they have jobs, steady income, that sort of thing.
Yep.
They're
Own property
also
too.
they're also very willing to do what?
Play nice with the government.
Which one?
The union government.
Very good. They are very willing to work with. Now they're Democrats, right? That party of the fathers, the Southern Party. They're Democrats, but they're very willing to work with the federal government.
Get what they want.
Hey, there we go. Now, who are the branchmen?
Hey.
The lower class, poorer, single men, maybe a bit more violent.
They're the
Maybe.
bandit
A little bit. Okay, so the branchmen are these men who are out in the sticks,
He
okay?
used a really good word too. He said opportunistic. They were opportunistic men.
Very good. They're opportunistic. They're looking around. They're in their early to mid 20s, aren't they?
They're the
They're
young
not
firecrackers.
married. Work is sporadic, right? They don't have all of the familiar obligations as what the courthouse faction has, so they can just kind of up and go as they please, right?
Which they do.
Which they do frequently. And let's just point something out. You know, I forget who said it earlier. Somebody said something about redneck. I think we were talking about the other one. We can also say that these are the Kurus,
Yep.
right? These are the Kurus. This is not just redneck. These are Cajun rednecks.
These are my people.
Okay? All right, these are the Kurus. So, so Reconstruction does, I really liked your explanation. It leaves a power vacuum, right? And who is going to fill that void? Number two, what role did racism play in the bitter feuds that developed between groups of whites in the Florida Territory?
they used it as a way to like overcome the Republicans, like the government.
Okay, who uses?
The branchmen were more
Okay, this needs some
Branch.
clarification.
I
We
know
got
it's
a
like
lot
the
of-
courthouse men, they would hire African Americans, but with very little chance of them actually advancing.
Yeah.
Now, these young white men, they're basically having to compete with these black men for jobs and that, and so it's
They
kind
were
of putting them almost on the same level, which they're not gonna sit too well with.
Okay,
It's rural justice is what starts taking
rural
place.
justice, very good. Okay, so we've got the courthouse faction, which says, you know what? We have a whole bunch of black people living here who can vote the way we want them to vote.
Let's give them jobs.
Let's give them jobs. Exactly right. And then you've got the branchmen who are coming. Why are they called that, by the way?
Because where they lived.
Because of where they live. What about where they live?
I was tiny woods.
Tiny, and then the branches coming off the different rivers and bayous and all that stuff, right? Okay, so we've got the branchmen who are saying, hold up now.
That's my job.
Not just that's my job, but that's my place.
Yeah, my right.
That's my
social-
social status. The branchmen start to see the courthouse faction as taking away from that white supremacy.
That pride. That's how I wrote it in my questions, the white supremacist group.
Okay, very good. So this is, and now let's make sure we clarify here. Are the courthouse faction men, are they equal rights for all and
No.
all that jazz?
Oh, God,
No.
They're just
Oh,
doing
no.
it to get what they want.
Exactly. They're strategically minded, whereas the branchmen are more
Pockets.
opportunistic, right?
Yeah.
They probably got some red bones in there too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, those of you who are familiar with red bone people? Okay. All right. Number 3, we already did that. Number 4, how was feuding used as a means of social regulation, and why was it more effective than other means in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? Let's go with the first part of that question first. How was feuding used as a means of social regulation?
Well, he actually talks about how the sheriff does nothing. Like every
Why?
time because he can't.
He can't, like, there's
He literally
too much
just
violence.
can't.
They can't, and then the state government is too weak to help and won't interfere. The governor usually doesn't want to interfere with all the white men.
And they're
Their
scared.
Yeah, I think
It's like a small army that these guys have that the government can't
Okay,
regulate.
very good. They realize that, you know what, if we are going to stop the violence, we're going to have an army. We're going to have a military occupation, basically,
Mhm.
to come in, stop everything, impose law and order, and then you're going to have intense martial law because these people are going out, especially at night. Those white caps they talked about, they're going out especially at night and they're murdering people.
Yes, they are.
And a lot more often than not, we see the murders. We go through the different statistics of the murders, and you know that somebody was the victim of a feud because why? Where was their
Between
wound?
families.
Where was the mortal wound?
In the back.
Remember that? In the back.
Oh, now I remember it. Sorry, I just had the paragraph. Just reminded.
The mortal wound from these feuds was oftentimes given in the back. And so as time progresses, eventually we have an outcry against this violence, and they say, what kind of man are you to shoot someone
You
or attack
sneaky.
someone who's unaware
Coward.
that an attack is coming, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of bushwhacking, they say. Those are ambushes, right?
Yeah.
You just attack somebody out of nowhere. So there's a lot of these things that are going on. And ultimately, so how's it used as a means of social regulation?
Well, it's frontier justice. You know, it's like.
Yeah, we've got rural justice going on. If something happens, he mentions some examples. What are some examples of reasons that these feuds?
There was something
spring
about a
up?
marriage problem,
Okay, somebody broke off
an engagement, and they weren't happy about
Family
it.
feud. What
You
else?
done hurt my sister.
Or she heard
I know there was one example where it was between like farmers, like somebody had
Land
stole like livestock or crops.
Yeah, the
And so-
farmer would not pin up his livestock
And it was
or
trembling.
could not keep them. Yes.
There was one, a jury failed to convict a murderer,
Okay. And
led to the victim's brother killing the guy with a shotgun and then
Back and
killings.
forth.
very good. Okay, these are blood feuds, and they
Yeah.
start over sometimes incredibly petty reasons, but this is how they regulate what's going on in their area, right? And so it's no wonder that they can't impose law and order. It's a wonder to me that anybody stayed living there. I would be like, no. We're moving to Shreveport, you know?
We're moving to Shreveport.
Let's go to New Orleans where it's safer.
That's ironic, right?
That's what it was meant for. Okay, so feuding ultimately it's not just rural justice, it's swift justice.
Yeah, it's the one that
You
they have
become
at this
judge,
point.
jury, executioner, right? You
Yeah.
take care of business right there. Now, why was feuding more effective than other means in the late 19th and early 20th centuries?
Because nobody official could do nothing.
Well, I think that's true. There is an issue of capability. Am I capable of doing anything? And the sheriff is charged over and over again, like,
it literally says he just didn't say or do
Right.
anything.
That he's just letting everything just kind of go, and he'll mediate from time to
He
time.
was scared.
But well, he's scared. He's probably also helping both people out. He's probably playing both sides of the fence as well. It doesn't mention.
Probably getting
So-
some money on the side somewhere.
Yeah, it's possible.
Sneaky.
But it seems to be more effective. One reason because you have law enforcement officers and others who are simply unwilling
Yeah.
or unable to do anything about the violence, right? But on the flip side, eventually we get to a point to where the violence has just taken over, right?
It's that
When-
mindset though.
When something becomes so ingrained in your culture and in your mind, how else are you going to solve a problem?
Yeah, to them it was the only justice that was getting delivered at the time, and it was the only way that they could resolve their issues. Because they weren't thinking about politically resolving anything. They were just like, well, he took my cow, I'm gonna shoot him. It's the logic payoff, apparently.
Right. But this is also a region that is technically, I mean, as we've said, rural justice several times. This is a very rural area, is it not?
Primitive, if you want to
So
say that.
they don't have a history of long-standing politics,
Or anything,
local government,
for that matter.
things of that nature, right?
Yes.
So there's a lot of reasons that we could probably say, but let's also point out sort of the obvious here. We've talked about the moral climate in Louisiana. We read that essay on it. A society without Christ, this is what happens. And we've talked about this several times about what does it mean to live in a society where God is part of your ethnic identity rather than your part of your life, your being, who you are, right? It's just a name. But a society without Christ, it leads to bloodshed, does it not? We have a lot of people, and this is not Catholic versus Protestant,
No.
but you've got a lot of people who claim Catholicism and they go to Mass, and then they'll leave Mass and go shoot somebody, right? You've got Protestants who are, they go to church and then later that night they go visit the prostitute, right? This is a society and a culture that understands what's morally acceptable and morally degenerate, and frankly, they don't particularly care.
Yeah.
It's that frontier mentality. Remember that in the very first couple of weeks we talked about this, that frontier mentality that came down with the Coeur des Bois, and they've integrated in with Native American lifestyle, and frankly, they see that as being so much more fun than
Well,
what they're
obvious.
allowed or not allowed to do within the church, right? And it's exotic, it's different, but that has now become part of a mindset. So at some point, I look at this and I go, good grief, why did it last all the way until World War I? And then the other part of me goes, good grief, how did it ever stop?
Yeah, curiously
It's
enough.
very odd, because especially nowadays, we just think Louisiana's a centennial, and just like any other state, and then you realize, only 100 years ago, sections of the state were in anarchy.
Exactly.
And
Exactly
we still
right.
have sort of that
But
mentality.
it is just going along with this idea of spirituality. This region, although it has the most churches on church corners, this is the least evangelical part of the state. Period.
And it's
this
funny,
is-
because we're at a Baptist college.
This is the part of the state that has the fewest numbers of professing Christians.
Wow, that's intense.
I'm just saying.
Doesn't seem to add up.
It doesn't seem to add up, does it? I mean, we've got Baptist building.
Well, they
We've
tried really
got-
hard to enforce it, but it didn't work, because people just didn't want to.
Well,
You can't really make people do anything.
Yeah, no, you can't make people do anything. But this just brings out that imperative. This is a spiritual imperative that we have to pray. Well, we pray for everybody, but my goodness, as you mentioned, Louisiana College is right here. And yet this is the most unreached area in the state? Something to think about as we go home. Thank you guys for a wonderful class. Okay, so be on the lookout for your test. It will be up and running over the weekend, hopefully by tomorrow, but it will be there, okay? Any questions?